Hello, listeners. This is Kat, and welcome back to Put Your Hands Up Podfics. This will be the continuation of Verdant Revolution. This will be Part 50, Chapter 48, entitled Edge of Duty. When Sekijiro saw that Aizawa was keeping his class past the regular end time, he was initially curious. The professor stayed the first day just long enough to realize that they were extra lessons. It surprised him that none of the students moved from their seats or decided to not participate in the extra classwork. On the second day, Sekijiro had thought that he and the administration were doing his class a disservice by not offering them the same option. Deciding to request that the students' sister class join 1A in their optional extra class time, Sekijiro approached Aizawa on the second day of rescue week. Aizawa stared blandly as the blood hero made his appeal, and Sekijiro gritted his teeth, thinking the worst. Instead, Aizawa simply and equally as dully told him that it wasn't optional for the students of 1A and to ask Midoriya and Shuzenji, as they were the ones teaching the extra time block. Sekijiro had received surprised looks from the school nurse and Midoriya when he'd made the request, but after only a second of deliberation, they had agreed. Midoriya just had to make a note to bring in more lab materials on Thursday. That was the first Sekijiro had heard of any kind of lab planned for Rescue Week outside of the USJ trip at the end of it. When he questioned it, both Aizawa and Shuzenji shuffled awkwardly while Midoriya just shrugged. 1A is on a separate teaching plan from 1B. That had been the first time Sekijiro had heard of that as well. The class began that day following the general guideline that had been set out for the week. Day 2 was dedicated to first aid training. Nothing too intensive nor as time-consuming as the optional extra credit first aid course, but overall, Shuzenji was pleased that she finally got to give a general first aid lesson to the new heroic students. Perhaps she'd have fewer students coming in with injuries made worse by stupid mistakes. Sekijiro was pleased to see that most of his class had taken up the offer of extra education. They had lost a few, of course, when it was revealed just how much longer this class would run into the night. But there were always those few that would turn down free extra classes. He wasn't overly concerned. You got out of college what you wanted to get out of it. Sekijiro was surprised to see that all of 1A had stayed seated, though. Not only that, but they had almost universally adopted expressions of dread. 2 claps rang out, clearly across the room, originating from the front where Midoriya was stepping forward with a congenial smile. How wonderful it is to have a few more students for our lesson today. In the previous 4 hours, we've covered basic first aid treatments. These are the kinds of treatments that you'll use in your day-to-day. In the next couple of hours, we'll be covering something a little different. Midoriya turned to write on the whiteboard in large, bold letters. Field medicine. Does anyone have any questions before we begin? One of the students from Class 1B, blonde and condescending, began, cutting through the silence with a sneer. Yeah. Why is someone from 1A up there? What makes you qualified to teach us? Anything you could teach us, we could teach ourselves. Midoriya took a deep breath, indulging in a cold smile. You must be Monoma. People enjoy talking about you. The blonde preened at that. Not enough of it is good. Monoma's preening turned to shock before quickly settling into a scowl. Midoriya continued before the blonde could open his mouth again. To answer your question, I have multiple doctorates in relevant fields, as well as experience in the topics that we'll be discussing. Monoma's lips pressed into a thin line. And before you can continue to make incorrect assumptions, Midoriya tapped the insignia on his shoulder. I'm not a student of 1A, but I am learning alongside them, as well as performing as a student teacher to them where relevant. Midoriya glanced across the class to see appraising looks and surprise, 1A just looked like they wanted to get on with the lesson so they could do their exercises and get back to the dorms. Any relevant questions for us today? A young woman with honey-brown hair spoke up next. What precisely do you mean by field medicine? Midoriya smiled at the question and nodded before beginning. The basics of first aid were taught earlier. This, however, will be an introduction to tactical combat casualty care. TCCC is something that was originally developed by the United States before it was standardized across their allied forces during the Third World War, or as you might refer to it, the first segment of the Quirk Wars. For 1B, this is something that is covered more extensively in an optional second-year course. For 1A, this is an introduction to mandatory course material during your second year. We want you to be made aware of its existence even if you won't be making use of it in its entirety during this year. The full course will see all of you getting a TCCC ASM, CLS, or MP certification, depending on what you are aiming for in your prior experience. It should be noted that this will be taught to everyone in 1A after we get everyone their EMT certifications. That will be about a 6-month course. We may condense it, depending on how the class does. Sekijiro spoke up with scrunched eyebrows as Midoriya paused. Why precisely are these courses not optional for 1A this year? Midoriya gave a small, apologetic smile. The Rat Overlord has decided that this year's Class 1A will be following a different teaching style and course load than in previous years. In the end, it comes down to figuring out which is more conducive to producing higher quality heroes. Monoma spoke up again with a snort. So we really get to prove we're better then. The blonde was cut off as a hand cracked against the side of his head with a hissed, "Shut up." Sekijiro frowned. Rivalry was one thing. It could be good for the classes to push themselves. But he didn't want needless hostility. As I was saying, Midoriya smiled and began again as if nothing had been said. We'll be covering a major part of TCCC today, and that is the March algorithm. Midoriya wrote the word out on the board and turned to continue speaking. Remember this mnemonic. It could save you or your friends during a combat situation. Massive hemorrhage, airway, respiratory, circulation, and finally, hypothermia. March. Midoriya wrote each word out on the board before putting the marker down and turning once more. This is not tailored to mass casualty care. This, March, is found generally in TCCC courses, as well as advanced trauma life support courses, and it details the steps in which we need to take care of the injured to provide the best chance of their survival. I'd like to say something right now, though. Don't let me catch you performing these procedures on a civilian if you have a wounded team or squad mates that need tending to. It's hard to swallow, I know. But the first priority is always keeping yourselves alive. You can't help anyone if you or yours are dead. A fair amount of uncomfortable grumbling sounded from the audience, but Midoriya continued before they could be bogged down by it. First, with massive hemorrhaging, we follow the 4 Ds. Midoriya once again wrote on a separate part of the board. Detect. Direct pressure, devices, don't dilute. Secondly, airway control. Let me remind you that the patient needs their airway to survive. Third, respiratory support. Now that you've confirmed their airway is clear, it's time to make the assessment of the respiratory system. Are they breathing? Do they have a sucking chest wound? Do we need to decompress their lung? Midoriya chuckled lowly, waving his hand in a vague dismissal. I can see some confused faces. Don't worry, we aren't expecting you to know all the terminology right now. Recovery Girl and I will be explaining and defining things as we go. For those of you who are more hands-on learners, we'll be having a lab for the students that stick around that long on Thursday, before our trip to the USJ. Now, where was I? Midoriya bent his head and upper body backward in a casual show of flexibility to read the board upside down. He smiled as he earned a few chuckles from the class. Ah, yes. C, as in circulation. Midoriya's head returned to its normal position, and he continued with the introduction. From this point, we'll be identifying other non-life-threatening bleeds, their pulse, and blood pressure. Shock assessment and treatment will also be addressed here. Finally, we hit H. Midoriya let his eyes casually roam over the students before locking with Todoroki's and holding them. Hypothermia, a key part of the trauma triad of death, alongside acidosis and hypocoagulability. It is a critical factor in trauma care that isn't often discussed in EMS. When you lose large amounts of blood, you also lose large amounts of body heat. Who knew? Head trauma also falls under H, and we'll cover that as well. Hypoxia, hyperventilation, hypotension, hypoglycemia. Midoriya turned and gave their resident medical expert a smile, and a brief gesture for her to take over. The third day wasn't any easier for the students to process, and Vlad had noticed several of them looking sick or shaken as they left the classroom following their morning lessons. He didn't blame them. Disaster response wasn't an easy topic at the best of times. Just as the afternoon before had started, Midoriya began by walking up to the short stage in the front of the room. But this time he paused, instead taking on the side role as Shuzenji had stepped up to address the group. Hello, dearies. As Midoriya would put it, we've spent the last several hours talking about disaster response and its procedures. Now, however, we'll be getting into a much darker side of things, and one that, as heroes responding to a disaster site, you'll need to have considerable training and expertise in. Shuzenji wrote lower on the board, her word smaller than that of the student teacher, but still plenty readable for the class. Triage. This is a... Shuzenji took a moment to look for the right word. Difficult topic for many heroes, both prospective and active members of the field. We are told so often that we don't get to decide who lives and dies, and yet that is exactly what you are being asked to do here. The old doctor began to write on the board while she spoke. In disaster situations, you are going to be dealing with a potentially unknown number of victims in an unpredictable number of states, from scratched to deceased, an unknown infrastructure capability, and an unknown but likely insufficient quantity of supplies. To make things worse, you need to be able to decide within, ideally, 10 to 15 seconds. Shuzenji stopped writing and underlined yet another mnemonic for the class to remember. SALT. Sort, assess, life-saving interventions, and treatment/transportation. She tapped each letter once with her cane, before she turned fully back to the students watching and continued. The responder needs to first confirm their situation. If this was a natural disaster, then they would more than likely be able to start into these procedures directly. If the situation were, however, the consequence of a villain attack, then the responders would need to secure the area first. It is not pleasant ignoring calls for help, but you cannot manage to help those in need while you are under attack. The young adults looked uncomfortable at the thought, but nodded in agreement. It was understandable, if distressing. When they arrive at the site, the first thing responders are going to do is call out for anyone that can hear them to come over. These are the walking wounded. The responders will ignore them. The class stiffened, and several even made questioning remarks, which were waved off by Midoriya. Those that can walk to you are responsive and not in distress. There should be a responder watching them to make sure no one's status deteriorates, but they'll be the ones you assess last. They are the ones most likely to live. The class was silent again, and Shuzenji nodded to Midoriya before speaking once more. This is part of the reason it is so hard for good heroes to perform triage. You are taught and trained that each and every person must be saved with no distinction. But life is not quite as clean as that. The ones that are not coming to the responders but are making purposeful movements and calling out to them, they will be ignored too. The classes stiffened further, but didn't make any comments this time. A young woman with vines for hair put her hands together in prayer, as Shuzenji continued with pity in her eyes. The ones that are not moving are the responders' first priority to tag. Tag, Kero? A short question from Asui had Shuzenji nodding. Midoriya held up a tag for the classes to see, even as Shuzenji began to explain. In an ideal situation, you'll have these. They help identify to the responders what status each individual has been assigned. There is no standard for these, however, and you may not even have them on hand. I've seen a dozen ways of doing it. Colored tarps, tape, tags, cloth, and even spray paint. You make do with what you have. The first thing that the responder will look for is any obvious sign of life. If there is contrary evidence readily available, such as some form of major head injury, decapitation, exposed brain matter, and the like, they are tagged black as deceased. Grimaces were seen across the crowd. The next steps, as the responder begins treating those in critical conditions, are to control any major bleeding, ensure that the airway is open, and to decompress the chest if needed. If it is a case of chemical attack, biological attack, or some form of leak, the responder is to give auto-injector antidotes. If the individual is a child, the responder may give them 2 rescue breaths after opening their airway. If they are not breathing after this, pulse or not, they are tagged black. Several members of the audience began turning green. Shuzenji turned and wrote 4 questions on the board. Is the bleeding controlled? Not in respiratory distress? Has a peripheral pulse? Obeys commands or makes purposeful movements? If they are breathing, then that's great. The responder will use these 4 questions as a guide. If the answer to all of them is yes, then that's especially great. They are either a green tag or a yellow tag, standing for minimal or delayed treatment, respectively. Shuzenji turned and sighed, looking out at the students that were beginning to appear as if they had aged during the lesson. If any of those questions are answered with a no, then the responder has one more important question to ask themselves. Is this person likely to survive given the current resources? If the answer to that question is yes, then they are the first priority in treatment. They are the ones that need medical attention first. If the answer is no, Shuzenji trailed off with another sigh. If the answer is no, then no matter how they look or how much their friend begs you to help them, you have to tag them black as expectant. They are not going to make it. Silence reigned as that sank in. Several students looked like they wanted to cry, while others just looked angry. Both are all too common in the medical field. Shuzenji frowned before deciding to continue the lecture. All right, listeners, this concludes the first half to Chapter 48 because this is a really lengthy one. It's a little bit different than some of the other chapters so far, and I thought this was a really great stopping point because I really like how Izuku and Shuzenji are kind of going through this whole thing together with the students to kind of give them an in-depth, right, at first aid. So it's really great how the author's doing this. So the second half to Chapter 48 is going to be up next, which is going to lead us up to the end of the week, right? And they've been hinting at the USJ. So I'm really excited for us to get to that point in this fic. If you have an opportunity, you can leave some comments below for me to see your thoughts, your reactions to the fic so far in the first half to this chapter. And just keeping in mind, the fic is located on AO3, so you can slide over there and leave comments and kudos to the original author to show your support. I'm sure it's much appreciated. As always, thank you all so much for listening.